Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be talking about Keito today. And like I said at the end of the last video, that means after this we'll have done at least one person from every unit with the exception of Ma'am. Which is pretty exciting because when I started this I really didn't have any idea how many people would even be interested in something like this or would want to listen to me talk about music and voices for an extended period of time, but the reception to these videos has been so positive, so once again, thank you for all of the support on these. But speaking of Keito, we'll start with a little vocal comparison. Originally, when I set this up, I hadn't intended for it to be in chronological order, but it turned out that way, and that actually will lead into something that I do want to talk about, so we'll listen to it first, and then I'll talk. I am glad that they're finally giving the characters songs in Twisted Wonderland. It has taken a long time, but it gives me a little bit more to compare to for at least a few of the voice actors. Admittedly, Leona actually doesn't sing a whole lot in this song, or at least he doesn't get a lot of solo features compared to the other two members of Savannah Claw, but there's enough that I can use it for this, which is nice. But that aside, in order, that is Binan, Side M, and then Twisted Wonderland. And in terms of years, the Binan stuff was like 2015, the Side M stuff, the first song was from about 2016, the second one was like 2021 or somewhere in there, and then the Twisted Wonderland one was just recently released this year. So the main thing I wanted to talk about in regards to the order of those songs is I have had some comments asking if I think that Ume-chan's voice was affected in any way by the medical issues that he experienced in 2018. And for anyone who doesn't know or maybe hasn't looked into it that much, in, I believe, May of 2018, he was hospitalized with something, and I am not going to try and say the full name of it because I will not say it properly. The short form of it is ADEM, A-D-E-M, and it's essentially a condition that shares a lot of symptoms with multiple sclerosis, but is only temporary and only occurs once. And while he was in the hospital recovering from that, he had other complications relating to the treatment of that. And I read up a little bit about it, but in short, it has to do with something between the brain and the spinal cord and the spinal fluid. It sounds very unpleasant and can be potentially serious. And apparently about 30% of people that go through this experience lifelong mobility problems as a result. From everything I have seen, at least from the notices that his team put out at the time, when he was released from hospital, they said that he had made a full recovery. But I have seen people wondering if it did affect his voice in any way. And obviously it's impossible to say for sure, especially because, as we found out, ensemble stars can sometimes record songs up to a year in advance. So it's very hard to specifically date when a certain song was recorded just based on when it was released. There's no way to correlate the two exactly. But the main thing I've seen people saying is that some of his higher end vocals, at the very least, don't get used as much anymore. And I did notice that going through this, but based on some of the vocal work he's done in later songs that aren't specifically Akatsuki, he can still seem to get there easily enough. So my impression is that the shift within Akatsuki's vocals that happened, and it does happen with all of them, it's not just a Keito specific thing, but the shift that happened around the time when music started is more a result of character direction than anything specifically to do with his vocal capabilities. And it also seems like at that time he was starting to sing with a lowered larynx a lot more. And I've said before, I'm really no expert on when people are raising or lowering their larynx, but Ume-chan has one of those voices where there is a specific tonal quality to his voice that is quite different between the two styles of singing. And at least for me, it's very easy to differentiate, which does not happen with a lot of voices. So that's my impression. It's not that he can't sing in the same way anymore, because he still certainly does, but I think it's a result of both character direction and maybe just him becoming more comfortable with using that lower part of his voice. And I'll talk about my impressions of Keito's voice more specifically when we actually get into the songs, but the last thing I wanted to say in this little intro part before we talk about Akatsuki as a group is that for anyone keeping track, yes, Sword Boy, but he has not been in the anime, so he hasn't sung as that character. On to Akatsuki as a unit. And I think this should be fairly obvious, but when I'm talking about Akatsuki as a unit, for the majority of this video, I am talking about the three original members of Akatsuki. And this is probably going to be a very short section because, once again, I really can't think of anyone that has ever complained about how they sound when they're singing together. They all have, like, not super deep voices, but they all have relatively deep voices, especially in comparison to some of the other units. As we've spoken about before, deep voices will typically always sound good when they're mixed together because there's less danger of vocal sound waves clashing with each other. But one of the things I did notice, and I'd alluded to it a little bit before, is that as time has gone on, Akatsuki's vocals in general have gotten deeper, and now they're starting to try and raise them up again, and we all know why that is. I don't think I have to specify. Happy Elements has made some bad decisions. But the main point I'm trying to get at here is that these seem to be unit-wide changes that are happening and are not specific to Keito's character. And all of them are good enough singers that they're perfectly capable of utilizing these different parts of their tones, as I assume they have been directed to by the producers. But again, bad decisions aside, Akatsuki has always had great music. They've always sounded great. I don't really have much more to say on that topic, so let's get into the songs. So again, not to stay on this topic for too long, but this is the only version of this song that I recognize, and I have had people ask me to compare the two versions, but the long and short of it is that it feels like nobody was really trying too hard in the quote-unquote redone version of this song, and that includes the instrumentals. And also I feel like this song is so iconically Akatsuki that anything they tried to do with it would never touch the original. Like when the first series of CDs came out, this was pretty universally regarded to be one of the best songs out of any unit, and I think it still holds up to this day, although unfortunately its reputation has been tarnished a little bit by the other version that came out. Regardless, I think you can already see some of what I was talking about in the introduction, where there's a lot of overlapping vocals, so you can hear the other two come in at the end of some of Keito's lines, and you can tell that they're all singing at a much higher tonal range than they normally do now. Like, their voices now sound a lot deeper, which again, because it extends to the entire unit, seems to be a very deliberate choice. And Ume-chan is another one of those singers, we've talked about a couple before, and Natsume most notably, where when he is singing with a raised larynx, the distinction between his head voice and his chest voice is very hard to parse. Because there are a couple of sections where he is technically going up quite high in terms of pitch, and it feels like he should be popping into head voice, and he probably is. There's just a very minimal change between his head voice and his chest voice when he is singing in this style. And it doesn't have the typical attributes that a head voice or a falsetto would, because he's not singing nearly loud enough to be belting, but his transition between those two styles is smooth enough that you really don't notice it unless you're looking at physically how high those notes are to sing. Ume-chan also has a very distinctive vibrato, which is evident throughout all of the characters he sings for. It's just something that he does. And we've talked about certain singers who've had this very tight, quick vibrato before, but generally when it's utilized, it's done for a very brief moment of time. Whereas with Ume-chan, it's just kind of his default. He can keep it up for a very extended time, which makes it very easy to hear when he's singing, but it's also not something you get a lot of from other vocalists. So it's very distinct in that way. So even in this one compared to the first one, I would say that his general tone is a lot deeper, and you can kind of hear that richer lower part of his voice that comes through when he dips down into those lower notes. The other thing with Akatsuki that I've noticed in general is that they don't do a lot of duets, and I think that just has to do with the style of the unit overall, because their voices sound perfectly fine together. It has nothing to do with an issue in mixing. It just seems to be the characters within the unit and how they fit within the unit are more of kind of they're doing their solo thing and then they're coming together to sing in unison. This is one of the few songs where they actually do have duets, so you get to hear him sing with both Kuro and Soma individually, and again, no issues there. One of the interesting things that I wanted to say about Keito's voice in particular is that I read somewhere that when people describe certain vocal colors or vocal qualities, they generally use what we would term positive temperature words to do it. Like you hear a lot about people that have warm voices or warm tones. And there are a lot of singers and ensemble stars that do have that, and I'm sure I've used it before when talking about people like Mao or Chiaki in other videos, but that you rarely ever see anyone described as having a cool tone. And while that's true, I don't necessarily think there's anything inherently wrong with it. And Keito to me has a very cool tone, but it's not cold necessarily. Like it's not a way that makes his voice sound unapproachable or standoffish. It's like, and this is going to sound very odd, but a lot of times when I hear voices, I get images along with them that kind of help me at least to describe what I'm hearing. And Keito's voice to me, when I say his tone is cool, I'm not talking like -30 on a winter day. I'm talking like an autumn breeze at night or a river on a hot summer day. Like there's something refreshing about his tone that I feel like you don't hear a lot of, and I don't think it's inherently negative to talk about it in that way. And I hope that makes sense, at least to somebody, because that is the image I get when I hear him sing. Like that's what I feel in his songs, and I really like it. And I think it suits the type of music that Akatsuki does very well. So that last note there really showcases the control that he has over his vibrato, because as I said earlier, he does have a very distinctive vibrato, but he can really tone it back when the situation calls for it. Like that line, he almost completely cuts it out until the very end of the word. And that's something that I think is very consistent within Keito's vocals, is that he's very deliberate when he sings. And it's not that he doesn't sing with emotion, because sometimes there is emotion that comes through in his singing. But unlike some of the other characters we've talked about before, where their vocal progression ties in with their character kind of opening up more, Keito is just a very internalized character. And he always has been, and he probably always will be. And that's not something that he's looking to change, because that's just a part of who he is. And obviously he has his creative outlets and he has his ways of being able to express himself, but that doesn't necessarily translate through to his performance, because when Akatsuki started, he had a very deliberate vision for them. And obviously as time has gone on and they're not necessarily needed to be like Eiichi's bodyguards anymore, it doesn't have to be quite so strict. But a lot of his vocal styles still reflect that because, you know, at his core, that is still who Keito is. One of the other lines in the song I really like is this one, because you can hear that transition between his upper tone and his lower tone, and he just kind of slides right down into it. His tone is also remarkably clean, regardless of what he's doing, which I think kind of adds to that coolness aspect of it, because it always sounds very even. So this kind of continues the point I was making in the last one, is that it's not that he doesn't sing with emotion, but a lot of times his emotion feels very controlled in the sense that it doesn't necessarily feel organic, but that might just be me as a musician projecting onto him, because it's the idea that, and I'm going to try and explain this in a way that hopefully makes sense. But typically when you play music that's written on a sheet in front of you, you will have something called dynamics written into the piece of music itself. And dynamics just tell you how loud or soft to play and when to get louder or get softer. And sometimes you'll have pieces of music that don't have dynamics, and it's kind of left up to the interpretation of the performer to place them in a way that makes sense. So Keito to me feels like when he is singing dynamics, he is singing them like he's reading them off a sheet. Like this is where it's supposed to happen, so this is where it happens. And this song is a good example of that because he has a lot of sections where he is kind of doing that push and pull where it's getting louder and softer within the same line of music. But everything is so clean and so evenly placed within the beat structure. Like I said, it feels like it's coming from a place of purpose rather than a place of being dictated by emotions. So I hope that makes sense. And again, I want to emphasize that nothing I'm saying is meant to be negative, because I really like the way that he's singing, and I think it's very suited to his character and very unique in terms of the characters that are in this series. Like, when I think about Keito and I think about his character, this is exactly how I would imagine him to sing, and I think his voice just reflects that so perfectly. So I had debated on whether or not to include this song based on the lyrical content and everything else surrounding it, including the outfits on the CD cover, which I also didn't include in the video for what I hope are fairly evident reasons at this point. However, talking about the music specifically, it is the only time that Akatsuki gets a song in this style, so I wanted to at least touch on that because it offers an insight into a different part of Keito's voice. And obviously Akatsuki's thing is traditional Japanese music, but I feel like the part that often gets overlooked is that it's traditional Japanese music with modern influences. Like, even from their earliest songs, they have had electric guitar solos. So it's probably not as traditional as it might feel in a lot of cases, because they're still employing a lot of these modern instruments. And we'll talk about this later in terms of some of the melodic structure of some of their songs, because it's particularly evident in Keito's solo. So bookmark that for now, we will get back to it. But this is really the only time they get into something that could be considered swing or jazz and is using big band instrumentation. And I think it's a good example of how versatile Keito's voice can be in the right circumstances. Because jazz music is interesting in the sense that there's a lot more freedom in terms of timing and in terms of beats and what the instrumentation is doing. But in order to provide vocals for something like this, you still have to have a very strong sense of where the beats are to stay on top of them. So I think it actually suits Keito's voice more than you might expect, because even though you would never really think of his voice or him as a character as being particularly flexible, he has such a good sense of timing that even though there's a lot of kind of swingy things happening in the background, he is still staying directly on top of the beat. And that, combined with the way the music sounds, makes it feel a lot more in balance than it might otherwise seem. So again, that's why I decided to include this song, because I thought it was important from a vocal perspective, but I'm not going to spend any more time on it than that. So the main thing about this song, and this actually kind of leads in from the last one, is that I don't think there's anything new vocally that we haven't heard him do up to this point, but the song itself stylistically is quite a bit different. It's got this like really chill, strolly vibe. Like, the idea of it is that they're supposed to be like going to a festival, which again doesn't necessarily fit with the impression that you get of Keito's character, but it's another instance of the music helping to make his voice sound more relaxed than it actually is if you break it down to what he's technically doing. Because the music is so swingy and kind of has this little flute section that goes through the back and the strings that are coming in, it sounds like it's moving back and forth, even though once again he is staying directly on the beat at all times. So it's really interesting that they're using the background music in a lot of cases to provide the illusion that Keito's singing isn't as precise as it actually is. And like I said in the last one, it actually ends up balancing itself out really well. This is one of those where he really lets the vibrato come out. And I think Keito's voice is, despite the fact that he can stay on beat pretty much regardless of what he's doing, I think his voice is very well suited to slower songs just because of his inherent tone and the way that he utilizes it. And there are some parts of the song where he's singing against the backbeat that has a lot of drums in it, so he gets to bring out that more percussive part of his voice. But then you get the section at the beginning where there's very little instrumentation happening. But again, because of the strings and the flutes, it kind of sounds like it's swaying back and forth, but I actually paid attention and kept the beat this time, and he is still completely on beat the whole time. Like, there is this concept in music called rubato, R-U-B-A-T-O, which I think I've talked about this before. Essentially, it translates to free time. So it's the idea of making beats longer or shorter without changing the rhythmic structure of the entire song. So for instance, if a song is in 4/4 time, that would generally mean you would have 4 quarter note beats per measure. So the beginning and the end of the measure are in the same place, but the beats in the middle can sometimes be either stretched or condensed depending on the emotion of the performer and how they're either playing or singing the song. So just like the last couple of songs we've talked about, albeit in a little bit of a different way in this one, the rubato is almost entirely in the music, and Keito is still keeping those beats where they were originally intended to be while he's singing. So this is kind of the first song, I think, where you can hear that there is a concerted effort to keep all of their voices tonally lower. I say that, and then in that last line, he goes higher again. But this was the anime ending song, so this was summer 2019, so conceivably, we could guess that it was probably recorded after Ume-chan was in the hospital. Again, no way to tell for sure, but it was well over a year after that point that it was eventually released. So if we assume that it was, he's still very capable of hitting those higher tones without any issue. And you can hear, this is another one of the rare songs where he does get to do duets with both Kuro and Soma. And you can hear in those duets that they are singing lower as well. So it is definitely not just a Keito thing. I don't think it was done in order to accommodate any sort of permanent vocal changes that he might have experienced or not experienced. And as I said, there's some songs later where he does go even higher. But at this point, and especially after this, when we start getting into the first few songs in music, you'll hear that just in general that Akatsuki just gets lower. And admittedly, it does sound a lot different, and that is because I'm fairly confident that this is where he starts singing with a lowered larynx for the majority of the time he's singing as Keito. And like we've talked about with some of the other videos, like with, I think Tsukasa's is kind of the big one where in Endless Bead his voice sounds so different. That's the main reason for it. So it really has nothing to do with his vocal range. It's just that he's using a different part of his voice. And he is one of those singers where it just sounds really different when he does that. So this was the first Akatsuki song that dropped after music came out, and I think you can hear that his voice definitely sounds deeper throughout. Even the sections where he's going a little bit higher, he's still using that much more lowered tone compared to what he typically would have done in some of the earlier songs. Other than that, I think this song does kind of play to some of his strengths in singing. He has a lot of sections where he's singing directly on top of the drums and keeping the same rhythm as the drums. So once again, it's kind of playing into the idea that his singing does tend to be very rhythmic, and in this case, instead of the music opposing that, it's staying with him the entire time. I almost feel like this song is a little overlooked when discussing the Halloween songs in OnStars, which might just be because Akatsuki's discography is so strong in general that it doesn't really stand out a lot, but I really like it. It's a really good song. It's incorporating a bit more of a different instrumentation. Like in some of the earlier songs when I talked about strings, it was mostly things like the koto and the shamisen, very traditional Japanese instruments, where in this case it is actually orchestral strings. It's violins. It's more of what you would consider a classical soundscape. And I think it suits the song really well, and Keito's doing some interesting things vocally. There's a little bit more in terms of being dramatic, and I think part of that might just be because in this case he's more or less playing a character. Like, they're supposed to be vampires. They're not really representing Akatsuki as their normal unit. And at least as someone that's done musical theater, I did a lot of times find it much easier to be expressive when thinking of myself as a character as opposed to myself as a performer. So I kind of understand it in that sense. There's still dynamics happening, but the biggest difference difference with this one compared to what he was doing in some of the other songs is that he's added a little bit of a whisper to his tone, so when he's singing quieter, it sounds much more dramatic because there's this added effect to his voice, like he's thinking more about how to change his voice to suit the song that they're actually singing. And I think he's playing around with his tone a little bit more here too. There are parts where it gets very low, but when he pops up into those higher sections, it does sound like he's using that higher part of his tone again as opposed to sliding up through the lowered part. So at this point, it's not that he's staying in one place for the entirety of songs, he's kind of moving around depending on what he's actually singing. So there isn't actually a whole lot of solo features in this song. He mostly stays down in that lower part of his voice again. But what I wanted to talk about more so was the instrumentals, and to come back to what I had said to Bookmark earlier, which at the time I had said we'd talk about during Keito's first solo, but this one showcases the same sort of thing, and I feel like I'll have enough comments about Keito's solo when we get there anyway. So this song I think is another good example of the melding between traditional and modern that Akatsuki likes to do, because especially in the verses, the backing track has this really almost muddy rhythm guitar that's happening in the background, while the vocal line on top of it is using a very traditional sort of Japanese melody. More specifically, what I'm talking about is something called a pentatonic scale. And a pentatonic scale is a 5-note scale with specific spacing between the notes so that it has a certain melodic line to it. And you'll hear a lot of traditional Japanese music uses this. There are varying interpretations as to why this may be, but the one I've seen the most often is that it's likely because due to the instruments they were using at the time, it was a scale that was very easy to play and thus very easy to create singing melodies to go along with it. And interestingly enough, one of the other instruments that it's very easy to play a pentatonic scale on is the piano, which on the piano, the 5 black keys are actually spaced out in a way that they are the pentatonic scale. So I did this on a piano app just so you can see the keys moving. This is Keito's first solo. Which I think at one point in the chorus it goes to what at least in this key would be an F natural, but the rest of the chorus stays entirely on those 5 notes. So if you ever hear that progression in a piece of music, and it's used in a lot of Ensemble Star songs and a lot of songs in other Japanese media when they're trying to create that traditional Japanese sound. So if you were ever wondering what it was, that's what it is. This is another song where I feel like overall he's trying to adopt this softer, more gentle aspect to his singing, and I think it's really effective for the type of song that it is, and also to show that he can keep it up consistently again while he's kind of playing around with his tone in general. There's one section here where he gets a little bit of a feature where he gets to go up pretty high. And this is another one of those examples where, again, I feel like it's very hard to differentiate his head voice from his chest voice, which makes me believe that he is probably singing it with a raised larynx just because of how tonally similar those two voices are. But like with a lot of the other units, one of the things I do appreciate about the music era is that they're starting to get a little more inventive in terms of the style of songs that they're giving to them. Like this song, for instance, doesn't really have the hallmarks of a traditional Akatsuki song. Again, it's got a lot of orchestral strings and things like that happening in the instrumentation, but it still feels like an Akatsuki song, and their voices still suit it really well. And then this one we're back to much more of a traditional Akatsuki feel, but I think it does reinforce a lot of what we've been talking about to this point and what Keito's been doing in the more recent songs, where he is flipping between tones a little bit more. He goes very low in this song and then again pops up pretty high in some parts. He once again gets to sing a lot with the percussive instrumentals, so I think at this point they've really figured out what works with his voice and he's able to slot into that very easily. So this one I think is mostly interesting because they're actually starting to add some effects, and they really haven't done a whole lot of that with Akatsuki music, which makes sense considering they're supposed to be the more traditional styled unit. You really wouldn't be using a lot of vocal effects or things that we would think of as being ultra modern in their music. In that very last part, there's a little bit of like a reverb, a little bit of a vocal compressor on his voice that kind of mutes the sound a little bit, but the thing I mostly wanted to talk about is the doubled vocals or the vocal layering that happens throughout a lot of this song, where he's not actually singing duets with anyone, he's essentially singing duets with himself. But he's singing duets with himself where he's singing a lower part and a higher part that they layer on top of each other, which I feel like is kind of the culmination of a lot of what we've been talking about in this video, because it's using those two parts of his tone and actually playing them at the same time. So it creates this really neat effect that almost does sound like a duet because his voice sounds quite different depending on what part of his tone he's using. So the idea of putting them both together and kind of running at the same time is actually really neat, and I don't think I noticed it happening until I actually sat down and listened to the song for this project specifically. And then there's this one, which we are going to talk about because it is technically a part of Akatsuki's discography. It is a Keito featured 5-star event. Again, the melody in the chorus does feel very Akatsuki. The rapping part is fine. We'll talk more about Keito rapping in a later song. And for all of this build-up, he really only gets to sing with Ibuki for like 2 words, so there's not a whole lot to talk about with their voices together. But I think you can even hear in this song, when he's singing with Kuro and Soma, again, that their voices are much higher tonally than they have been throughout the music era. And I had kind of glanced over this at the beginning, but I think it's safe to say the reason that they're trying to bring their tones up again now is because Ibuki has a higher voice, and it would sound really off for him to be singing with the 3 of them all using a much deeper part of their tone. So I think they're trying to moderate that, which again, there's nothing wrong with how they sound, but it's very obvious there's a shift happening, and that's really the only reason to explain it. It feels like such an abrupt change going into this song, but Deadman's Keito is doing a lot of interesting things, both in this one and in Rock Roar, that he never really gets to do in Akatsuki music. And I'm sure in the Ray video I talked about how much I appreciate Deadman's for existing in the first place, but this is one of the reasons. And obviously you can hear that when he's singing with Ray and with Koga, he's not quite getting to the levels that they are in terms of the growl and the rasp that they're putting into their voices, but it's much more pronounced than anything he's done before. I've talked about how Keito typically has a very clean tone, and here there's just the tiniest edge of a little bit of a raspy whisper to it that is not the same as the whisper singing he was doing in like the Halloween song, for instance, but it has much more of an edge to it. And this is one of those songs again that having a cooler singing tone really works to his advantage, because this song is not supposed to sound warm in any sense of the word, so his voice actually suits it really well in that sense as well. I feel like he could probably push harder if anything, but again, considering the circumstances surrounding this song within the story and the sort of emotional roller coaster he was on at the time, I'm glad we at least get to hear this little bit of what is essentially a rock edge to his voice that never gets to come out anywhere else. And that I think is continued even more into Rock Roar. There's one part here where he actually growls, which I think I would have been more surprised about if I hadn't heard him do it as other characters, because he does do it as Leona in the Savannah Claw song, and I was going to mention that at the beginning and thought I would leave it until now. So yes, he is perfectly capable of growling. I don't think there are many circumstances where Keito the character would do it, but once again, for that and for many other reasons, I am glad that Deadman's exists. The other thing about this song that's really interesting is that, once again, you get to hear that tonal shift, but he's doing it depending on who he's singing with. So when he has a duet with Kuro, he's singing very, very low. And when he has a duet with Rei, he's pushing his tone up again. So they're very evenly matched in that sense. And it's interesting because they could have gone for a kind of contrast between the voices when he's singing, but they decided to go for keeping them as similar as possible, which in this case, because all their voices sound really good together, ends up being very effective. Again, he gets to really pull out the vibrato in this one. He doesn't actually sing a lot on his own, and he doesn't actually get any duets with Madara specifically. The only one is that one line with Kuro and Madara. So I put that in just so you can kind of hear their voices together. And in this particular case, Keito kind of gets to be the moderating line between them, where you have Kuro's voice that is below his and Madara's voice that is above his. And that's something we haven't talked a lot about because in general the mixing in Akatsuki songs is very even. So we haven't really gotten to discuss how Keito is mixed with other characters that have voices that are significantly different to his. This is kind of the first example of that. And I wish they would have gotten to sing together more, but at least we have that one line to show an example of that. Hearing this now, I guess I've never really thought about it before, but generally when he sings with Rei, they do try and match their tones pretty evenly. And Rei's another one of those characters that can definitely play around with his tone and sing lower or higher depending on whether the situation calls for it. So it's definitely interesting to me that they always try to make them as equal as possible. And they sing together, I'm not going to say they sing together a lot, but in every song that they're in together, they will have a duet line together. So at this point, it seems to be a pattern that's developing. The only other character in this song he gets a significant solo with is Kaoru. And I was thinking about this when I was editing the first part of this commentary, that I talked about characters with inherently warm voices like Mao and Chiaki, but I didn't mention the people that Keito actually sings with, which in this case is Kaoru and also Eiichi. And I think the reason I differentiate those is because Kaoru and Eiichi have more of a nasalized warm tone as opposed to an inherently warm tone. But the main thing to take away from this is that when you have a character with a cool tone duetting with a character that has a warm tone, they will typically sound good together. And at least in terms of duets in these cross-unit songs, he actually gets a pretty long one with Kaoru. So you can really hear how their voices play off of each other in it. Again, just like I mentioned in the Shu video, no duets in this cover song, which is kind of sad because it would be nice to hear him sing with Shu and Mika. But still very important to note within this video because in some parts of this he is singing very low, probably some of the lowest we've ever heard him sing, and this is also the only time in the entirety of his solos and on-stars that he gets to go into falsetto, and it happens in a cover song. And I kind of get it because it's not really something that would fit Keito normally, but I'm glad that we at least have this example of it so you can hear what his falsetto would sound like. And it sounds really nice, so I'm hopeful that maybe in the future he gets a chance to pull it out again. But if not, at least we have this. And then in this song, he almost gets to stay exclusively in that higher part of his tone. He gets the duet with Eiichi, which we had just talked about why their voices work really well together. He gets a really, really tiny duet with Midori, and Midori's voice is one of those where, kind of like with Madara, they actually let Keito take the lower part of that. I wish he would have gotten to sing with Mao and Leo, not only because I would like to hear what their voices sound like together, but also because their characters actually have existing relationships, so I always like hearing characters sing together where it fits for the story as well as allowing us to hear different voices mixed together. But this was kind of the main song I was talking about back when I said that I don't think the higher parts of his tone have suffered at all over the years, because he's still very capable of creating that very clean tone, and this part especially. Once again, he's going up very high. This one I would almost call a belt because there is a little bit of power behind it, but again, it's so clean, and he's still able to maintain that very easily. So once again, I think a lot of the changes in Keito's vocals come down to voice and character direction as opposed to what Ume-chan is capable of doing with his voice. And at least within Akatsuki songs, he never really gets to talk, so I threw that in at the beginning again just to get his voice baseline, although he is speaking very, very low here. In terms of the rapping, because he's very good at staying on beat, there really isn't an issue of him falling behind the beat or anything like that. I'm going to compare all the characters to Hip Mike because of the style of this song in particular, but he sounds like Ray, and I'm not talking about OnStar's Ray, I'm talking about Hip Mike Ray, who kind of has this very even, almost monotone feel to his voice and has a tendency to slide words into each other instead of enunciating everything really cleanly. And that's the effect that Keito's giving off in this song as well. So again, nothing inherently wrong with his rapping. I feel like with Ibiki there now, we might get more of it in the future, but we'll see how all of that turns out. So this has always been one of my favorite solos from the first batch of them. I think just because it is a little bit slower, it is, for Keito, this is probably the most emotional he gets, and I think it makes a lot of sense based on what the song is about. Because for the most part, solos in OnStars can kind of be broken down into three categories. There are the personal character development solos, there are the solos that are directed at an unnamed person, generally like an audience or fans of that unit or of that member specifically, and then there are the ones that are directed at another character. And these are the ones that I think are often most debated in the fandom, because a lot of times people have varying opinions as to who exactly they are meant for. But I think Keito's is one of the ones that is the most clear-cut, because this song is about Eiichi. And reading the lyrics, there's really no one else that it could be about. And it's been proven time and time again, especially in the early days of Ensemble stars when Keito really wasn't that close to the other members of Akatsuki yet. If there was anyone that was going to make him express any sort of vulnerability, it was Eiichi. So I think the fact that there does seem to be more natural emotion in his voice, the tone of the song overall, the lyrics, and like I'd mentioned earlier that I said that slower songs fit his voice really well, this is one of those examples because he has so much control over his long notes and where he brings in the vibrato and where he holds it off. And it really showcases how clean and precise his tone is. So yeah, this is still one of my favorite solos. I just think everything about it is so well put together, and I really enjoy listening to it.
黒い仮面や白い表紙空虚な世界で天使を通しゃって好奇心は止まらない不た刺激に満ちた色に覚えた規則性の世界で結ばれた因縁で自分のオリジンを巡ってここでそうも知らない道の衝動を
And then in contrast, we get Unpredictable Reincarnation, which is certainly unpredictable in the sense that I don't think anyone expected Keito to get a song like this. And aside from Kengeki no Mai, it's kind of the only time that he gets to sing in something that has like this jazzy big band style. But there are still elements of that pentatonic scale within the melody of the song. So it's a fusion of a lot of things, and I feel like that is very representative of his character, albeit in a much different way from his first solo. And this one lyrically, again, is much more internalized in terms of him just kind of looking at how far he's come and where he's going, and reflecting on that in essentially a very positive way. So Keito is another one of those characters where his two solos are so different from each other, but I feel like they're both very true to his character, and I'm glad that he gets to show off different parts of himself within those solos. And that brings us to the end. I feel like once again I talked a lot more than I was going to, considering the introduction to this was shorter than my normal ones, but I think I've mentioned before how overall the old 3A class was my favorite. and me having great affection for all of the characters in that class and the journeys that they went through, particularly in the first game. So I always figure when it comes to those characters I'm going to probably talk a lot more, and I apologize for that. But as always, I hope that it was interesting. I definitely had fun getting to talk about Keito. And next up, like I said last time, we're going to do Izumi. And then after that, I was debating between the 3 younger Ryuseitai members. I have had people ask me to do Chiaki, but that would mean doing 3 of my 3A boys in a row, and I thought that might be a little much. So I decided I would do one of the younger Ryuseitai members, and I was trying to decide between them. But because Shinobu has now had his second shuffle unit, and he is in the first one of those select songs, he has one more song than Midori does, and I think a couple more than Tetra does, which was weird to me. But I think it's just because Yoshking is in so many music projects that I'm so used to his voice by now that I just assume Tetra has had more songs than he actually has. So regardless, because of those reasons, we're probably going to do Shinobu, who is a character that I also have great affection for, so we'll see how that one goes. After that, I do kind of have the next 2 videos planned out, but I won't say who I'm doing just yet. I'll save that for next time. So as always, I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like, comment, do all of the things that the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.